Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm going to show you an experiment about how people respond to change. I've only got 15 minutes to do it. There's not going to be a lot of preliminaries in here because I really need to get into it because there's just some essential things I really want to get across to you in this talk. It is focused on active travel, but I think the implications of what I'm going to show you extend beyond active travel. I know a lot of people in this room, I realized when I arrived this morning already. For those who don't know me, I head up a unit called the Behavioural Research Unit at the ESRI. We are a collection of behavioural economists and experimental psychologists. What we do is we look at what influences people's decision-making and behaviour. Increasingly, what we find across multiple policy areas is that you have to worry not only about things like attitudes and opinions, but you have to worry about perceptions and comprehension as well. These things are really important, and some of that will resonate as I go along. So that's the unit, that's what I do. I'm basically a nerd, right? And I sit there running experiments, designing experiments, analysing data, and getting really excited about the results. And the study I'm going to show you today, I'm very excited about. It's funded and commissioned by the NTA. We have started a research program looking at people's perceptions and understanding of active travel and their response to active travel initiatives. I also want to thank Fingal County Council, who are also working with in this space. It's early days. I'm going to tell you a little bullet point overview of a big international review that we've done. It's available online. You can get that. I'll show you that. And then I'm going to tell you about this experiment, which is the first empirical study that we've done, and we're really excited about it. I do need to say it is not yet peer-reviewed. This is preliminary analysis. It's for your information and to get you thinking about stuff as the scene setter, which is my mission here this morning. Right? It's not citable or quotable yet, but there will be a report available in the next few weeks or maybe a couple of months. Okay? So those are the preliminaries done. First of all, the international literature review. If you start any research program, the first thing that as a scientist you do is you look at what everyone else has done. Now, this is freely available on the ESRI website. What we did was we reviewed essentially how the public respond to active travel initiatives, right? How they perceive them before and after, and also to some extent the degree to which active travel initiatives themselves change people's behavior. I'm going to say very little about it. This is like more than 100 academic papers we've reviewed. If you're interested, it's freely available online. The bullet point findings are pretty straightforward. I mean, infrastructure, active travel infrastructure, can and does, on average, increase active travel. If the implementation is poor and not well designed, of course it doesn't. Right? But on average, in general, yes, it does. And that's clear from the research. The key things that predict its success are connectivity, that is, can I make complete journeys by this method? And above all, probably, particularly for cycling, safety. Those are the things that predict the success of active travel initiatives in terms of the likelihood that people use it and change their travel modes. Design itself has a really strong influence on safety, so we can see that in the research as well, that how things are designed and segregation of cycle lanes is an absolute key issue here, has a strong influence on safety perceptions. And there are systematic misperceptions. So beyond the influence that the active travel infrastructure has on people's behavior, what we can see is when we study their perceptions and their understanding, there are systematic misperceptions, particularly on the impact of business and on car travel. And those misperceptions are people assume negative impacts on business, yet on average schemes actually have slight positive impacts on business. Not in all places, not everywhere, but if you look at the international literature, on average the benefits for business are positive. And people always, in this literature, in these scientific studies, seem to overestimate the impact on car travel, which turns out to be much less than they think, often on commutes matters of minutes as a result of lanes being removed and so on. So there are systematic misperceptions that are in there. I keep repeating it, on average. Of course, it depends on the implementation. Perceptions of fairness matter greatly. And there's a really important point here. So public acceptance of active travel is not just about the fairness of the system that is put in place. Is it fair to cyclists and car drivers and older people and younger people and disabled people and able-bodied people and so on? But the procedural fairness of how it was decided. Who decided? Who did they talk to? did the community approve? These issues are really important, people's perceptions of fairness. Now, the people who are taking photographs of this slide, there's a lovely paper that's freely available up online. I'm encouraging everybody, please, 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 to look at it, because I'm summarizing a great big paper in just 6 bullet points here. There's loads more in there if you think this stuff is important. And finally, in there we have a whole section on what is called status quo bias. Now, what I'm going to try to get across to you more than anything else this morning is that we think this is probably the most important psychological phenomenon when it comes to trying to enact rapid change, not just in active travel, but in other areas too. But since so much of climate policy and environmental policy at the moment requires rapid change, we think status quo bias is super important. That's what the experiment's about, and that's going to be the bulk of what I'm going to talk to you about this morning. Okay, so here we go with that. What I want you to do, I'm going to stay quiet for 20 seconds, is read this. Okay. Now, what we did was we took a nationally representative sample of people in Ireland, nationally representative sample of adult people in Ireland. We gave them this description, and we randomized them. Half of them saw what you're reading here. And after they'd read this, we asked them to evaluate this town plan. So we said to them, what do you think of this town layout? And we gave them a scale from 1 to 7. Do they strongly like it? Do they strongly dislike it? They can put it anywhere from 1 to 7. What you'll see there is that obviously that's a description of a town that has prioritized pedestrians and cyclists and active travel generally at the expense of cars, and overwhelmingly a representative sample of Irish people likes the layout of the town. And it's a very simple experiment based on a 3-paragraph description and a 7-point scale. I'm not making great claims about it here, but what I'm going to show you in a minute, I am going to make bigger claims about, okay? And what you find is overwhelmingly there's a positive response. I want to say something very quickly about this. The strength of this positive response is very, very weakly related to background characteristics. And one in particular I want to stress is there is no difference here between rural populations and urban populations about how much they like this description of a town layout. Right? And I say this because every single time I get the chance, because all over our political system, everyone appears to believe there's a huge rural-urban divide on climate and environmental issues. Every time we try to measure it, it's either really, really small or non-existent. Right? It's true among the representatives, it's not true among the public. Okay? I've made that point. Right. The more important thing here is we get this really positive response to this layout. You get a mean of 5.47 out of 7, and you get people on the dislike side, so below the midpoint of 4, which is the neutral point, we've got less than 10% of the population saying they oppose a town layout that prioritizes pedestrians and cyclists at the expense of cars. Okay, half the sample were randomized to see the description I showed you. The other half were randomized to see this. Now, you don't really need to read all of this because it's almost identical. It's not identical because there are a few words that are different. Right? The town doesn't exist in its form already. There is a proposal to transform it to the exact description I showed you a moment ago. Okay? It's a plan, and the word would is included where necessary to say what's going to happen according to the plan. That is the only difference between the two descriptions. Okay? And the half of the population that's randomized to see this description is asked what they think of the town layout. Well, here's what you saw before for the if it already exists. The active travel layout, that already exists. Here is what happens if it's a plan. We've now halved the people who give it the maximum 7 out of 7. The average has fallen by about a point, which is almost about half of a standard deviation, which in effect size in psychology is really large. That's a bit technical. The least technical way I can describe how big this effect is we now have almost a quarter of the population opposing it when it's a plan, as opposed to less than 10% when it exists already. It's exactly the same town, we're just asking them what they think of the town layout. Right? That's status quo bias. Right? And what status quo bias is in behavioral science is when something is there already, people support it much more than when it's a proposal or a plan that you might change to. In other words, there's this kind of inbuilt bias against change. And when we measure it in active travel in a simple experiment like this, it's really large. Now, you might look at that and think, that's not really large. Let me give you a better indication, therefore, of how large it is. right? It's more than twice the size of the different scores between the drivers and the non-drivers. So in that experiment, we split the people between the drivers and the non-drivers, right? The drivers dislike the town layout more than, actually what I should say is the non-drivers like the town layout, because everybody likes the town layout on average, right? But there's a difference between the drivers and the non-drivers. And the non-drivers like it more. But the effect of status quo bias is more than twice as big as the difference between the drivers and the non-drivers, which is something we think is normally a really important element of people's acceptance of these kind of plans. Status quo bias is twice the size. Do you know what else? It's twice the size of the difference between cyclists and non-cyclists as well. And we think that cyclists, that's a real predictor of whether people are going to support active travel. But status quo bias is twice as big. Just the simple difference between whether something is planned or is there already. So this is a really important psychological phenomenon if we want to be implementing active travel schemes and other schemes, because status quo bias applies to change. Generally, we've measured it here in the context of active travel, and I'm trying to get across to you quite how large this psychological effect is. Okay. So an obvious question I said, well, okay, who's most prone to this? Well, the answer is every single demographic group in our sample is prone to status quo bias. So we see a difference between the planned and the existing conditions for all of them, but there are some differences. In general, women gave more favorable responses to that town layout when it already existed, but the same when it was planned. So status quo bias is a little bit bigger among women than it is among men. Right? The difference in the response to change. Women generally more pro-environmental, somewhat, not a lot, which has been found in many studies actually, but not when it's a plan, only when it's there already. Now we see a small difference between urban and rural communities. Okay? So there's no difference in overall liking for the active travel plan, but there is a greater skepticism in the rural community about the change. So they have a larger status quo bias, even though there's no difference in their overall liking for the active travel versus the not active travel plan. Okay, so there's a bit of difference in who's susceptible to status quo bias, who finds the change more difficult. We also find that there are no differences by age or education in any of this, okay? Now, this looks a little complicated, so I'm going to explain it briefly, right? What we did, after we started running this experiment, we got initial evaluations from people, is we gave them more information, and they could select what information they wanted, right? So we gave them buttons, and they could pick topics, which there's shorthands for down here. So effects on business is down here. How long it's going to take is the time one. What will the impact on traffic be? Was the local community consulted? Is this common in other areas? What's the community opinion of it? What facilities for disabled people? Environmental benefits? Access for services, who proposed it, how it fits with the history of the town, what are the health benefits, right? So you had all these buttons and you could choose which ones you wanted to pick. So of course what we're interested in here is, what's the difference between when it's planned and when it exists already as to what people choose to then explore, right? So we get a behavioral measure of what they click on and what information they seek. Interestingly, I think, so this is a slightly complicated graph. Ignore the bars for the moment, just look at the dots. On the vertical axis here, this is the proportion of people who picked that topic as one of their top 3 topics, okay? And these dots here will show you that the most important things for everyone, whichever condition they're in, was the community consulted and what did the community think of the plan or think of the town layout, right? So that community involvement, that sense of fairness that we found in the international review and how important it is to involve the community comes out as the most important things up here. There are other things that are important too, the impact on business and traffic, and on services, on disabled people who proposed it and so on. But the overwhelmingly most important ones was the community consulted and did they like it. But there are also differences between whether it is planned or whether it exists already. And when it's planned, all of a sudden what we see is a focus here, as soon as the scheme is planned rather than exists, on the potential negative effects rather than the benefits. So the difference between the dots, which is then plotted down here, the difference between the orange and the blue dots is the difference between the people who saw it as a plan and the people who saw it as already the existing town layout. And when you look at the difference, what happens, which is these bars here, is as soon as it is a proposal, a plan, it's like people ask a different mental question. Instead of saying, do I like it or do I not like it, they kind of go, oh, what could go wrong? Right? The psychology of status quo bias, we think, appears to be that what it does is, when something's a proposal or a plan, people investigate it mentally in a different way. And they worry about what might go wrong rather than evaluating it on its own terms. And we can see that in what they then seek information about. Here's some good news. After we gave them more information, which we agreed with the NTA was sort of typical information that would be true for these kind of active travel initiatives, we tried to make it as representative as we could. When we did that, we actually found that evaluations, as soon as people really started engaging with the information, started to improve, particularly in the planned condition. So where it was a plan, people went looking for negative information, they started worrying that it might be a bad thing and looking at that information. When we started supplying that information, their evaluations tended to improve, particularly in that condition. And then we looked at, right, okay, what is it that they have to read about in order for that improved evaluation to come through? And the answer is, they have to read about those things that they were worried about, the impact on business, but particularly they want to read, if their evaluations going to improve, about what the community thinks of the plan, and were they consulted, and have other communities done it? So it's reassurance. It's reassurance about the business impacts, but it's also reassurance about community involvement, how much they like it, were they consulted, and are other communities doing this too? Right? When it's a plan. So it's not that people dislike active travel infrastructure. Very, very few people do. But when it's proposed or planned, they worry about it, they need reassurance about it, and we can see from this study the kind of reassurance that they need. Okay? One other wrinkle in all of this is, we believe from talking to the NTA that 12 to 18 months to make a change like this is probably a reasonable time frame. Hearing about that time frame, getting that information had the strongest negative impact, because it seems that people's expectations are you can do it more quickly than 12 to 18 months. When they discover a plan might take 12 to 18 months to implement, it actually knocks evaluations down. Okay, so that timescale thing matters. Okay, my final slide. What are the implications of all this, right? Town layouts promoting walking and cycling are popular, right? But status quo bias is a large barrier to change, larger than the difference between drivers and cyclists. When initiatives are planned, people initially really focus on the negatives. They worry about what might go wrong, but rapid reassurance, particularly on community consultation and opinion, business impacts, and schemes elsewhere, limits that. Evaluations then start to improve quite quickly. And the implementation of timescales are negative. Hopefully, I appreciate I've gone very, very quickly. I only had 15 minutes to try and get across a scientific study, which isn't even quite complete yet. But hopefully, that's a decent scene setter to provoke some discussions during the day, the rest of the day, which I'm really looking forward to. And thank you very much for your attention. Thanks a lot.